In this lesson, we're studying contract verbs. And a good way to start would be to remember what we learned about the square of stops as it applies to nouns. We learned that some nouns are going to end with a labial letter. It could be P, it could be a beta, it could be a phi. And when those letters meet a sigma, then they become a psi. They become the letter that they sound like. Also, the velar letters and the dental letters, whenever they meet a sigma, they transform to become the letter that they sound like. This square of stops applies mainly to nouns, and sometimes it applies to verbal words, mainly to participles. We haven't studied participles yet. But this kind of concept is a good introduction for us to think about how contract verbs work. So a contract verb is a verb whose stem ends in epsilon or omicron or alpha. And examples of these kinds of verbs would be poieo, or it could be plerao, or it could be agapao. So these are going to be our example verbs as we work through the series of contractions that can happen with these verbs. The first rule we want to remember is that U forms from epsilon omicron, or the combination of omicron epsilon, or a double omicron. So for instance, if we have the stem poie, which is from poieo, the connecting vowel is going to be omicron, and the ending, if it's the first plural form, would be men. So we've got poie, a, men. That becomes poiumen because epsilon and omicron form omicron upsilon. So instead of saying poieomen, the Greeks would say poiumen. It's just a quick blending of those two sounds, and it forms this diphthong. If we have a verb like plera, plus the connecting vowel epsilon, plus the second plural ending te, instead of saying pleraete, the Greeks would say plerute. And so it's because of this rule of contraction. The omicron and epsilon form an omicron upsilon. And plera, if the connecting vowel happens to be omicron, say it's the first plural ending men, we'd have plera amen, that too becomes plerumen. So again, what we're saying is that omicron upsilon, pronounced something like u, forms from these three combinations, epsilon and omicron. It could be omicron and epsilon, or it could be a double omicron. All of these are going to form the omicron upsilon diphthong. Epsilon-iota forms from epsilon epsilon. So if we have poie again, and the connecting vowel is epsilon because the ending is te, the second plural, we have poiete, that would become poiete. So epsilon-iota forms from two epsilons. The third rule is that omega forms from omicron, and maybe if there's an omega in there, or really the combination of any other vowel with these two, omicron and omega, they're going to end up being omega in the final form. So we've got a verb like agapao. The stem is agapa. The connecting vowel, if it's first plural, would be omicron with the men. Agapa, men, ends up being agapomen. Again, we could look at the third plural form. We've got agapa plus the connecting vowel omicron, and the ending is nsi. Practically, whenever you see this ending attached to the verb, it ends up being usin. But if you look at the final form, the omega has basically swallowed up the vowels that could be around it, and that's fairly common. You see that kind of thing often. So what we're saying is that omega forms from omicron and omega with the combination of certain other vowels. So we have the final form here, agaposin. Alpha forms from alpha epsilon. So we have a verb like agapa plus the connecting vowel epsilon, and the second plural ending would be te, agapate. So the alpha kind of swallowed up the epsilon, and it ends up just being alpha in the final form with a circumflex over the vowel to let us know that there was a contraction. Agapa plus the connecting vowel epsilon plus the third singular ending iota would end up being agapa, again with the circumflex above the alpha, but the iota subscripted here, and that's because the iota subscripts when it follows a long vowel. Now we might ask ourselves, okay, well to this point when we've seen a iota subscript, we've trained our minds to think dative singular, and we translate it as a noun. True, but what we can do is ask ourselves, is the root of the word or is the stem of the word a noun or a verb? If it's a word like logo, we know that that forms from logos, which is a noun, so we'll translate it as a noun and in the dative case. But if the root of the word is a verb, in this case agapa comes from agapao, as we learn it in the vocabulary, then we know that it must be, in most cases, the third person singular. So we want to consider the root of the word, whether it's a noun or it's a verb, and that'll help us translate it correctly. But yes, some verbs will have a iota subscript, just like some nouns have it. Eta forms from epsilon and alpha. If we reverse those, if it's alpha epsilon, the alpha kind of swallows up the epsilon and it just ends up being alpha. But if they're reversed, if it's epsilon and alpha, then the epsilon, we could think of it as a lengthening to an eta. So poieo, if we have a third person middle passive ending, like psi, it ends up with the final form being poie. We might ask ourselves, how did so many letters, what happened to all those letters? Well, they simplified and contracted. For one thing, if you look at the ending, it starts with a sigma, but it's between two vowels in this form, preceded by an epsilon, followed by an alpha. When it's between two vowels like that, it often drops out. And then we have just a chunk of vowels. We have this middle form here, poiei. Well, the two epsilons are going to simplify, and one of them is just going to drop out, and we end up having poiei. All right, well, now we have an epsilon and an alpha. That's going to simplify to an eta. Eta is a long vowel, and what happens to the iota? When it follows a long vowel, it subscripts. And so we start with poiesai, and we end up with poie. Okay, much easier to say. Maybe a little harder to figure out what happened to all those vowels, but that's what the final form would look like. Or if we applied it to pistuesai, the same thing would happen. Remembering that the sigma normally drops out between two vowels, it would be pistuei, and then pistue, and then it would simplify to the iota would subscript underneath that eta, and it would end up being pistue right there. So when we see a verb that has a iota subscript like this, it could be the third person singular in some cases, present active indicative, or sometimes a iota will subscript when we have the third person singular middle passive ending, psi. Sometimes it contracts. And so we just want to study the context to figure out what's happening to the verb. But yes, sometimes we'll see the iota subscript with verbs as well. Omicron-iota can form from Omicron-epsilon-iota. So plera plus the connecting vowel epsilon plus the ending sigma, which in the final form the iota is usually added, it would be plerois. In other words, the connecting vowel just drops out and the final form is plerois. Again, for the third singular, the top of the plerois is the second singular. You fill, it could be. Pleroi, it would be he, she, or it fills. And here, the epsilon dropped out again. So let's review these contractions before we end this review of Chapter 17. Poieo, okay, that's the lexical form. Plerao in the middle, and agapao. If we look at the first singular form of poieo, what happened there was the omega basically swallowed up the epsilon. It's kind of funny, the lexical form is poieo, but as it's written in the Greek New Testament, it'll generally be poio, and the epsilon will be kind of swallowed up by that omega. Poies, there's a simplification of the two epsilons. One of them just drops out. For the poie, the same thing happens. One of the epsilon drops out. For the first plural, poiumen, we have the contraction of epsilon and omicron. It becomes poiumen. That's one of the first rules that we learned. That we've got poiete. That's two epsilons. Those are going to simplify to become an epsilon and iota. And again, the changes are marked with a circumflex above where the contraction happened. And then the final form underneath poieo here, poiusen. There was a contraction and a simplification. The final form would be poiusin. Plerao, if we look at the first form, the omicron is kind of swallowed up by that omega. We've got plero, I fill. Plerois, we have the simplification of these vowels. The epsilon drops out. And same thing happens for the third singular. In the first plural, plerumen, the two omicron simplify to become plerumen. Instead of pleramen, it's plerumen. And in the second plural, plerute, an Omicron and Epsilon formed in Omicron Upsilon, again marked with a circumflex. The third plural, plerusin, we have a simplification. One of the Omicrons is going to drop out. And then agapao. The first form would be agapo, as it generally appears in the Greek New Testament. The alpha is swallowed up by the omega. The second singular, the iota still subscripts, because in this case the alpha is long. The alpha, we could think of it as swallowing up the epsilon that follows it. And the iota will subscript, and the sigma will stay there out at the end. Agapas, you are loving, or you love, it would be translated. The third singular, the alpha again swallows up the epsilon, and the iota subscripts. First plural is agapomen. The alpha and the omicron form an omega. The second plural, agapate, the alpha swallows up the epsilon, marked with the circumflex. And then the third plural, we see again alpha plus omicron are going to make the final form of an omega, marked with the circumflex. Agaposin, they love. I think you'll find that there's a lot of like the little nitty-gritty details for the contraction rules, but if you look at these forms, even if we forget the contraction rules, usually we'll be able to parse them correctly. But because there might be a doubt or a question in our minds, we want to be familiar with the contraction rules so we can be especially confident when we parse.